Uh, Thank you for that introduction. I'm happy to be with all of you this afternoon. I'm seeming to have a little bit of voice problem here, so bear with me. I want to talk about some terms relative to riparian areas along streams. I want to talk about the other topics that are listed if you can see the presentation outline here on your screen. And let's start by having a look here at some terminology. Riparian is a term that is widely used in reference to an area that is adjacent to a river or stream, and the riparian zone is generally defined as that zone adjacent to the stream where water moving either into or out of the stream has an effect on the depth of the water table and the availability of water for plant growth. And the term riparian woodland or forest, of course, would apply to forest cover or woodland cover growing within this particular zone. The diagram that you see on your screen now is to just illustrate what we're talking about here in terms of this riparian zone. It's the zone adjacent to the stream bed in which water is close to the surface within the stream channel, but because of the water moving in the stream, it may extend out some distance beyond the actual edge of the channel itself. You can see in these three photographs some characteristics of riparian zones. The upper two photographs illustrate riparian zones in grassland areas here in California where the annual precipitation is not sufficient to support woodland cover, but because of the moisture available in the riparian zone, we have riparian woodlands along both of those creeks. The lower picture is a riparian zone in the conifer forest. The abundance of water in this zone often results in hardwood species being present as opposed to conifer species. Now, there are certain characteristics of streams and the riparian environment that are important to understand from the standpoint of the physical characteristics of these streams. And the first of these is the topography. Terms that are shown here are terms that I will refer to as we move forward in this discussion this morning. The stream, of course, is the body of water at the bottom of the cross-section, and it often sets on a gravel bar in the lower reaches of streams. The escarpments are the banks dropping down to the gravel bar or to the stream itself, and in lower reaches of streams we also often have natural levees that have built up by deposits upon the floodplains of the streams. The stream gradient refers to the steepness of the surface of the stream, and this is generally measured over a distance of 100 feet or 100 meters, which is referred to as the reach, and then the rise or the drop is the change in elevation. This would be the way we would measure slope in a topographic situation. If we had a reach of 100 feet and a drop or rise of 5 feet, that would be a 5% gradient for a particular stream. Some of you may be familiar with Strawberry Creek that flows out of Strawberry Canyon through the Berkeley campus and then goes underground out to the bay under the city of Berkeley. In Strawberry Canyon, it has a gradient of about 9%. On the Berkeley campus, that gradient is only 3%. Streams, of course, on their lower reaches tend to meander, and this meandering results in the cutting of the outer banks in the curves of streams due to the higher velocity of the water at that location, and then deposition forming what are called point bars on the inside of curves of streams. And these meander patterns become very important to the ecology and establishment of riparian vegetation. Streams can also be characterized by their riffle pool sequences. These are areas of pools in which we have relatively deep water as opposed to the water flowing over the riffles, and these become very important gradients that affect stream velocity, that provide resting pools for a number of fish. And they also provide for the incorporation of oxygen into the stream water. This cross-section of a general channel illustrates the long-term effects of geomorphic process in cutting a channel through an area, developing terraces by deposition over time, and within these terraces producing an active floodplain where we have meandering taking place as the channel cuts in one direction or another over time. Of course, there's a lot of variation in these channel cross-sections depending on whether we're up in the headwaters or into the lower reaches. Headwater streams tend to have very narrow cross-sections as opposed to the cross-sections that we would find in the lower reaches of streams. The riparian zone, as a result, is relatively narrow in these headwater streams as opposed to the situation further down in the streams. Now, from a plant standpoint, there are 5 important characteristics of the riparian environment that influence the growth and type of plants that we see within this riparian zone. And they're illustrated here by these arrows to point out that they vary from the stream surface up through the channel to the floodplain or to the levee. And in some cases, this variable increases as we go up, or it decreases, or it increases as we go down. And let me give you some more specific examples. The depth of the water table is a very important ecological variable for determining which plants are going to grow at different locations within the channel cross-section. And of course, it's the distance from the zone of water saturation in the gravel bar or in the soil beneath the terrace itself. And again, this distance increases as we go from the water surface up to the floodplain. Some streams are referred to as influent streams or gaining streams because they are fed by the local water table, and the water table would be found in these cases to be higher than the surface of the stream, while other streams, particularly as we get further down the stream into its lower reaches, are referred to as effluent or losing streams because water from those streams is bleeding out to form the water table, and so the water table decreases relative to its level where the stream is adjacent to the water table. So the farther out you get, the deeper it is to a particular water table. These are some tanks that I used to do a study of root growth of riparian species in relationship to receding water tables to get some idea of the potential of different species for growth in relation to depth of water table. And in a 60-day study, the willow, sandbar willow in this case that I studied, was able to extend its root down to a depth of 2 feet, cottonwood down to about 4.5 feet, and valley oak down to more than 5 feet. This genetic difference among these species, of course, is very important in determining the locations within the stream channel that we would find sandbar willow as opposed to cottonwood, as opposed to valley oak. Valley oak, with this capacity to sink its roots down very deep relatively quickly, enables it to grow up on the levees along the rivers, whereas the willow, particularly sandbar willow, stays down on the gravel bars. A second characteristic of importance to plants is the duration of inundation. Inundation refers to the period of time that the stream channel or the adjacent landscape is underwater. And of course, during periods of inundation, oxygen is expelled from the gravel bar from the soils that are inundated. And of course, if we go from the top of the channel to the bottom of the channel, the duration of inundation is going to increase. Here, for example, are a couple of views of Dry Creek up in Sonoma County. On your upper left is the stream in April after an extended period of rainfall, and you can see that the gravel bars are completely inundated by water, in contrast to the picture in September, where we have a large pool of water on the left, but most of the gravel bar that was inundated in April is now exposed. Some species have evolved capacities to deal with inundation. Willows in particular are noted for their parenchyma tissue, which is a set of pores that extends through the stems of the willow up into the upper branches that allows oxygen to be taken in through the bark and move down to the roots, which, along with the lower portions of the willow, may be underwater, may be deprived of an external source of oxygen, but this tubing, if you will, allows for oxygen to supply the roots of willows. And of course, they're very well noted for their ability to withstand long periods of inundation. Scarring refers to physical abrasion that takes place when, during high water events, sand and gravels are moved along by the flowing water, and they have the potential for scouring not only the stream channel, but plants growing in the channel. When we have a very high velocity flow of water, that water will be able to pick up gravels and sands and move them and abrade not only the channel but the plants themselves. You can see over on the lower right-hand corner here, if I can get my pointer to work, is an area where the bark has been basically scoured away, sandblasted, if you will, by water movement to expose the cambium. Willows are remarkable in their capacity to heal these scarring wounds very quickly. Willows are often bent over by the movement of this material, of gravel in particular, and the term training is usually applied to those willows within the stream channel that, if you will, have been trained by the scouring of material. Wood characteristics, of course, determine the elasticity of different tree species that might occur within the riparian zone. The modus of elasticity is the amount of force in pounds per square inch that are required to bend a piece of wood of a given dimension, of a given length. And the willow, the amount of necessary to bend the willow is considerably less than is the case with the oak. And you can see in the upper right these willow hoops that these guys have made that they're able to make because of the flexibility of the willow. The flexibility of willow allows it to bend during these periods of scouring, whereas if we had oak seedlings establishing on the gravel bar, they would not have the capacity to bend, and they would tend to be broken off instead. Nutrient concentration varies within the cross-section of the stream, being very low on the gravel bars and much higher as we move up, and I'm talking about nutrient concentration in the soil itself. This is a cross-section of a stream. You see the gravel bar down here, and you see the floodplain bank that's composed of silts and clays, and the nutrient concentration in those silts and clays is much higher than the nutrient concentration in the water and the nutrient concentration in the gravel bar itself. The silts and clays have a cation exchange capacity that allows it to hold mineral nutrients against the downward movement of water or against the flow of water through the gravel bar that the gravels and the sands and the gravel bars do not hold. So from a nutrient standpoint, the gravel bars are very low in nutrient status as opposed to the upper reaches of the stream channel. Plant species have evolved a capacity to deal with these low concentrations of nutrients through their rates of transpiration. a valley oak transpires about 4 gallons of water a day at a 10-inch diameter tree, whereas a cottonwood about 25 gallons a day. And we can think of this as a procedure that the cottonwood has developed in order to glean this very low concentration of nutrients out of the water in the gravel bar, the water in the stream. So they're pumping a lot of water to get the nutrients they need. Valley oak in a much richer substrate condition in the siltsema clays on the floodplain does not need to move that much water to get the same amount of nutrients.
Hey,
Joe. Yes.
Joe, we're getting some comments that asking if you could speak up a little bit.
All right.
And I know sounds like your voice is kind of ragged today, but
yeah, it is. I shall. Thank you.
If you could speak up a little bit, that'd be great. Thanks.
All right. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, aeration is the fifth of these factors, and I apologize for my voice trailing off here. And aeration, of course, refers to the amount of air in the water or in the soil itself, and it increases, of course, from the water as we go up. And aeration in the stream, of course, occurs when we have rapids or ripples in which oxygen can mix with the stream water itself and get incorporated into that stream water. This occurs, of course, in the riffle sections of streams where oxygen readily enters into the stream water. In a study I did along Dry Creek in Sonoma County, I found that we had primarily adjacent to pools, willows growing, but in the riffle areas, alders were more prominent, and I concluded that this probably had something to do with the amount of oxygen in the water that the alder, without having parenchyma tissue, it doesn't have the ability to move oxygen down to its roots, so the oxygen provided in the water in riffles compensated in part for the lack of oxygen in the pools that the willows were accommodating due to their parenchyma tissue. Now, there are factors that control establishment of seedlings in riparian zones that combines the various aspects of some of these factors that we've already talked about. These factors include seed supply, and observations and studies have shown that not all riparian species are releasing their seeds at the same time. A study that Stella and his associates made in the McCollum River a number of years ago showed that the Fremont cottonwood produced seed earlier in the season than either Gooding's willow or sandbar willow, and the number of days during which seeds were being distributed varied among these species as well. In addition to that variation, there was a variation in seedbed condition along these streams. The water table that moves from the stream into the gravel bar, into the adjacent soil, has above it a capillary fringe where water is moved up a few centimeters to maybe as much as 10 centimeters, depending on pore space, above the water table itself. This results in a condition that's favorable for growth in that riparian zone, but above that riparian zone, the situation is too dry for germination and establishment of seedlings, and of course below that riparian zone, things are too wet, I should say, within the area that's flooded by the stream. But there's a narrow band of conditions that are just right for germination of these species, and Mahoney and Rood have referred to this as the recruitment box. They wrote a very interesting paper a number of years ago on what they call the recruitment box model. And they propose that there's a box, if you will, shown in green on your screen, in which recruitment of riparian species can take place. This is where we have an overlap, if you will, of seed release with a potential recruitment band of gravel bars adjacent to streams where the stream is receding but the capillary fringe is maintaining a moist zone that still has oxygen in it that allows for the germination and establishment of these seedlings. In this particular diagram, in May, although we're having a receding stream hydrograph, the seeds are not arriving, they're not being released. And of course, after June in this diagram, we continue to see a recession in the stream height in which we would have a moist zone. But again, the seeds have stopped being released, and so we're not recruiting any seedlings after that time. So we often find that there are very narrow limits during which seedling establishment can take place because of this essential combination of decreasing stream levels and the release of seeds by the riparian species. We see in a number of streams in California, particularly in the Sacramento Valley, a topo sequence of different species illustrated here that are pretty much a reflection of these gradients of depth of water table, inundation, scouring, oxygen supply, and nutrient availability, with willows occupying gravel bars and the lower elevations of the escarpments, often followed by mixtures of cottonwood, alder, sycamore, and then on the floodplains, again in the Sacramento Valley, something like valley oak would be at the top of the topo sequence. I'd like to, pause at this minute if anybody has any questions before proceeding on.
There's actually an opportunity for people with different internet speeds to sort of catch up, because sometimes we find that, there's a little lag time. There's some simple question that Joe can address in this little space. Okay, I think we can move on, Joe.
Okay, I tried to go back and identify whether there were any questions there, and I seem to have cut myself off here, but I think I'm back online here in just a minute. I'll have to, okay, very good. All right, let's then move on. What am I not doing right to move on? Richard, I seem to be getting a box that does not allow me to move the slides forward. It's time to say help. Any advice here? Oh, there we go. How do we get past questions?
Richard, go ahead and advance it.
Okay, now I think maybe we're back online. It says riparian communities in forested landscapes, and I try to advance to the next slide. Maybe you can do that for me, Mike, or whoever's. Okay, I want to talk about some riparian communities in forested zones in California, and basically divide the state up into 4 major regions, one of which I'll divide into 2 regions as well. And so once again, I'm unable to advance the slide. If someone could advance the slide, we'll start with the coastal riparian forests. These obviously are those forests that are along the coast of California. We're primarily talking about the north coast because of these are riparian forests within conifer zones. And here we have redwoods often down at the stream flats adjacent to the streams, but hardwood species here are often things like red alder in California Bay. The height of the redwood, as Mike pointed out in his presentation, often limit light so that we don't get a lot of hardwood species sometimes in the coastal riparian forest, particularly when the cross sections are relatively narrow. These forests are characterized by high annual precipitation, high temperatures, summer fog, and for the most part are on sedimentary rock. If I could have the next slide. The intermountain riparian forests occur between...
Joe, just tell me when to advance, and I'll do the advancing for you, okay?
Okay, thank you. These occur in the Klamath and Siskiyou Mountains of northern California. Fremont cottonwood is probably the commonest species in these types. We get elements from the Pacific Northwest, such as Sitka willows in these areas. These are areas, riparian forests, in which we have high annual precipitation, warm summers, cold winters, and most of this is in a landscape dominated by igneous and metamorphic rock. Next slide. The Sierra riparian forests I've divided between west side and east side forests. The west side forests support Fremont cottonwood, mountain alder, Pacific dogwood, often incense cedar, red willow. They're characterized as forests that depend very much, or riparian zones, I should say, upon snowmelt runoff. They have hot summers, cold winters, and usually carved out of granitic rock. Next slide is the east side. In the east side, western black cottonwood replaces Fremont cottonwood as the dominant species in this type. At higher elevations in these areas, we find aspen as part of the riparian woodland, as well as water birch. Very hot summers in these areas, but very cold winters. Again, snowmelt runoff and granitic rocks characterize these riparian zones. Next slide is the Southern California riparian woodlands that we would find in the Angeles Mountains or Cleveland National Forest, those sorts of areas which at higher elevations support conifer forests but have riparian zones. Western black cottonwood, western sycamore are common here in these zones. They're characterized by relatively low annual precipitation, hot summers, and relatively mild winters. Next slide. I'd like to go on now to talk a little bit about natural disturbances and vegetation response, and there are 4 natural disturbances that I want to highlight. Next slide. Flooding is one of these. Flooding can have a direct mechanical effect upon plants in the riparian zone. It can dispel oxygen from the soils, and it can also actually erode the banks and undermine trees. I think the next slide illustrates 3 of these 5 environmental factors that are influenced by flooding, inundation, scouring, and aeration. Next slide shows a typical phenomenon associated with flooding in the coastal forests, particularly in the redwoods on redwood flats. You should be able to see here on, I don't know if you can see my marker now, I've lost my green marker, but what are called, there we go, mud lines on the, thank you, the base of these trees, representing the depth of water that flowed through this forest, carrying silt and clay that plated out on the trees. On the right-hand side, that lowest level is a deposition of silt along Bull Creek from the 1955 flood, about a 4-foot deposit, and then in the background, another deposit of about equal height that was laid down in the 1963 flood of that portion of the Eel River and its tributaries. These events of inundation related to floods have significant impacts on the different tree species that are present. Next slide. Scouring, of course, is another thing that takes place during flood events, and that scouring not only affects the plants within the stream channel, but it can erode banks and cause the collapse of trees into the stream itself. Next slide shows in the lower right-hand portion Bull Creek up in Humboldt Redwood State Park. You can see the creek is meandering in the left portion where the marker is, but when you come around to the lower right-hand corner, the 1955 flood actually cut across the meander. The stream was relocated, an area of redwood and adjacent gravel bars isolated due to this reconfiguration of the stream. So scarring and stream meandering are associated with flood events, and they can not only undermine trees but also change the location of the stream channel, often leaving some portions of the riparian forest, high and dry, so to speak. Next slide. I just want to sort of talk about human effects on flooding. Flood reduction occurs when we have dam construction, and the dams regulate, of course, the high flows. Stormwater retention projects also can help to reduce flood peaks. Flood is likely to increase due to certain types of logging practice, due to agricultural practices, and also due to urbanization. Next slide. Landslides and debris flows also affect the riparian zone by the physical movement of material downslope. The next slide just highlights different types of landslides and debris flows that can take place, from rock falls to very complex movements of slumps and flows along the edge of riparian zones. The next slide highlights, of course, change in the depth of water table that will take place as a result of debris flows and landsliding. And the next slide, there we go, illustrates a debris flow in the Cascade Range in Florida. As you can see, it brought a lot of large woody debris down with it, but it's raised the height of the stream bank in the area where it reached the stream, and the depth of water table will, as a result, be greater following this landslide event. And the plants that can be recruited there will depend pretty much on their ability to reach water through growing through that material. We know that landslides are often repeated, if you will, on the landscape. This is a USGS map of landslide potential for a portion of northeastern Contra Costa County that's based primarily upon historic landslides. The next slide illustrates a portion of Jackson Demonstration Forest, and if you can run your cursor up below the number 35, there's a loop there, that's it, showing a very large landslide, but within that large landslide, if I had this at a larger magnification, you can see that there had been numerous other smaller landslides at that same location. And this is a result of the topography, the geology of that place, creating a very unstable situation that we can expect to see future landsliding taking place in. The next slide, of course, talks or identifies the human effects on landsliding. We can reduce this occurrence by the dewatering of slopes, by the construction of retaining walls, by armoring stream banks. Logging may often increase the potential for landsliding, and road building itself is probably a major factor that results in the increase in landsliding and debris flows. Logging will, of course, affect the potential for landsliding depending upon the type of logging that is done and the size of the openings, but we must, bear in mind that the geology of the area is very important to whether a clear cut like this will result in landsliding or not. The next slide shows problems associated with poorly located roads, roads collapsing during periods of wet weather, poorly drained roads in which runoff from the road eventually results in the road itself falling away. So there's much that can be done relative to road sliding to minimize much that can be done relative to road construction to minimize landsliding and debris flows. Here's an example of alder stands occupying a 1964 debris flow in French Pete Creek in Oregon. You can see they've come in quite thickly onto these flows. The next slide is a slide just to call to your attention wildfire as a factor in the riparian zone. I'd like to talk about in the next slide a number of impacts that can take place relative to fire in this zone. Obviously, plants can be killed by fire. We can lose canopy cover. We can also see shifts in species composition. And the responses that plants have to wildfires involve sprouting, new seedling establishment, and recruitment of large woody debris. Next slide just shows an area of a study I conducted with one of my graduate students back in 2006. There was a fire in Plumas County, became known as the Independence Fire, and it occurred on Third Water Creek and Fourth Water Creek, which are tributaries to the Middle Fork of the Feather River. The next slide illustrates responses to burning. Some plants, as I've indicated, are killed by the fire. Other are stimulated to sprout either from their roots or from the base of the plants, or sometimes all along the stem. The next slide compares the sprouting that we observed a year after the fire among these various hardwood species. Douglas spirea and thimbleberry, 100% of the plants had resprouted, whereas in mountain alder, Pacific dogwood, and arroyo willow, only 30% of the plants that had burned were resprouting. The conifer species within these riparian zones on Third and Fourth Water Creek obviously do not have the capacity to sprout. They were not resprouting. Another study shown in the next slide was conducted along Deer Creek above Chico, California. And the next slide illustrates a fire scar. In this study, we collected fire scar material to date the number of years since the last fire that had burned in the riparian zone. We did this by counting the tree rings into that first scar. And the next slide shows the response of 4 variables in contrasting conifer with hardwood species in terms of canopy cover. In the upper left, you see that as time since last fire extends, the percent of canopy cover of conifers increases, while the percent of canopy cover by hardwoods decreases. In terms of basal area, as the time since the last fire increases, in other words, the fire-free period gets longer and longer, the basal area of the conifers increase, and the basal area of the hardwoods was shown to decrease. In terms of seedling recruitment, again, as the time since the last fire increased, we get a larger number of conifer seedlings per acre and a smaller number of hardwood species. These would be willows, cottonwoods, alders, as that time since the last fire has increased. Similarly, the number of saplings per acre of conifers goes up, and the number of saplings of the hardwood species goes down as a result of an extension of the fire-free period. The next slide illustrates the recovery through sprouting of some hardwood species in the Angora Creek area adjacent to Lake Tahoe. The Angora fire burned very heavily in these riparian zones, but you can see sprouting has taken place following that fire on the part of the hardwood species, whereas obviously the lodgepole pine and the other conifer species were not resprouting after the fire. So the presence of fire is a very important tool, if you will, in maintaining, or has been, in maintaining hardwood species in these riparian zones within conifer forests. The next slide shows wind throw in an intermittent stream in the Oregon Cascades. The next slide illustrates the factors that affect wind throw in riparian forests. These are channel and floodplain width, the topography, soil saturation, and tree species. The next slide just contrasts a couple of channels. The one on your left would be prone to much higher wind velocities because the topography is not necessarily restricting wind through this area compared to the one on the right, which is a much narrower channel. The next slide points out that topography, as we move into headwaters areas or upstreams in steeper landscapes can funnel the wind as the wind blows into the openings of the canyon and is concentrated further up in the canyon. The next slide is a cover of a report I did looking at wind funneling by topography at the Sea Ranch on the Sonoma County coast. And those arrows indicate areas of high wind velocity as a result of wind funneling. And the upper end of those little canyons were areas where in a very high velocity wind event in 2001, a considerable number of trees were blown down in those areas. The next slide is just to point out that wind throw in riparian zones, and this would be applied also in general to forests, are much more likely to occur when the soils are wet, when the shear strength of the roots in terms of their contact with the soil is weakened by lubrication. The next slide is to sort of characterize some variations in tree species in terms of their propensity for wind throw and breakage. Where we have platform roots, as would be the case in something like Sitka spruce, we have species that are quite prone to wind throw compared to heart or taproot sort of forms of root systems. There's a difference in wood strength between something like grand fir and Douglas fir in the windstorm events of 2001 at the Sea Ranch. There was considerable damage in grand fir and riparian zones simply by the trees being broken off by the wind, whereas Doug fir, much stronger wood, didn't suffer this problem. Those trees that were higher or more exposed to the wind were trees that often were the ones that were blown over. And those trees that had a very low live crown ratio were also trees that came down in the wind. And these are generalizations that would occur not only in riparian zones, but in other forest types as well. The next slide identifies some human potential effects on wind throw. Proper road location can reduce this potential in some areas where the roads are built parallel to the incoming wind direction. Those road openings can act like funnels to accelerate the road, and then where you have a turn in the road, the trees at that location are exposed to higher velocity winds. And so proper road location outside of riparian zones can minimize this problem. Increased potential, again, may result from logging where we expose trees in the riparian zone to high wind velocity, and road building that may affect root systems of trees can also be a problem. Next slide are some references, and I'm happy to take some questions now. And are the questions
good? Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I was just going to say, we have a couple of questions already here, and I'm going to bring them in and see, whoops, just disappeared. Where did it go?
I've got some questions, but they looked like they were the previous set of questions for John, or for Mike, pardon me.
Well, there was one about your evapotranspiration studies and whether they were done with similarly sized plants.
Yes. Well, that comparison of willows and oaks and cottonwood, they were all 10-inch diameter trees. There was a little bit of difference in the height, but not much.
Mike De La Salle, what happened to the question spot? And we have a question down here from James Lee. I'm just going to restate it. Your definition of riparian zone is very intuitive. You have recommendations for putting into practice. Particular flood recurrence, inundation area above, within a certain height above groundwater. I guess from a management, what are the management implications of defining a riparian zone buffer widths don't really do the job, right? So what is your suggestion? How
Well,
should a riparian zone be defined?
yeah, this this is an interesting question because it can be defined by coring to get down to the water table, but that's a very expensive proposition way of handling it. Uh, in some situations, the width of that zone is pretty well defined by the riparian species, the willows, the cottonwoods, the alders. But I know in some situations we do have conifer forests right down to the edge of the water, and we don't have the ability then to define it in that way. If we have stream flow records, and for some streams we do have stream gauging stations, then that riparian zone from a standpoint of the plants is usually definable on the 5-year recurrence interval of the floods. But from a standpoint of the road location, et cetera, bridges, we would use a much longer return interval of maybe 25 or 50 years to define that zone.
One more question from Stefan, and then Mike, you should bring up Mike LaQuarrie's second presentation.
Sure.
Stefan wants to know, do we see wind throw immediately adjacent to channels? And is it common to see trees fall and then exposing roots that deflect water, causing more scour? My observations would say yes. What would yours say?
Yeah, mine would too. Yes. The channel is an opening that wind can funnel through, and we often see trees are tipped over